everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Antelope Hill Book Club podcast. I am your host, Taylor Young, and we are joined today by two guests. We have Zach Kidd, Zach Logos, who is, these are both first-time guests, but we have talked with Zach before on his own show. But anyway, we have Zach with us, and we have Eric or Aarvoll from Return to the Land. So if you guys want to say hello, introduce yourselves real quick in that order.
Yeah, certainly. First off, I've done quite a few podcasts with you specifically, but a bunch of the different books on Antelope Hill. So I've always liked reading the book content from Antelope Hill. Just a small background on myself. I'm pretty much just a person who got interested in politics about 4 or 5 years ago and decided to start up a live show kind of discussing philosophy, culture, history, the broad things that I think Antelope Hill covers. I have a deep interest in National Socialism and a lot of the philosophy that comes from that. So I specifically like a lot of the National Socialist texts, which I guess would be probably why I've been invited here for this book discussion. So I'm happy to be here.
Right. I'm Eric, known as Aarvoll online. I've talked about philosophy and politics for a little over a decade on YouTube and elsewhere. And now I'm the president of Return to the Land, an initiative which I'm sure Darre would have approved of. However, I don't really consider myself a National Socialist strictly. I haven't read a ton of National Socialist literature, but thank you for the invite because it has been refreshing to get this very unexpected depth from a book that's about the peasantry. I kind of expected platitudes about like family values, and it's actually pretty rigorous anthropological argumentation about the nature of the German folk. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, no, thank you both. Thank you both very much for coming on here and talking about it. And I'm glad, Eric, that you appreciated the book. Um, there is a lot to it. It's almost deceptively thick. When I picked it up to start studying for this episode, I was like, oh, this is a little thicker than I remember. And then it's about 400 pages, and it is also not very large print. So, but there's no wasted space in here. He has a lot to say, and it's all very much on topic. It contributes to his overall argument, and I think a lot of his arguments and the topics that he's addressing are were obviously relevant back then and remain relevant today. So just a very brief background, I guess. This is Darre's first book, The Peasantry as the Lifeblood of the Nordic Race, that we are discussing today. Darre was a German. I believe he was born in Argentina, educated in England and Germany and Argentina, and then became part of the leadership of the SS. He was one of the early kind of major figures in the NSDAP. He was very much associated with their agricultural organization even before they came into power, and then their agricultural policies after they came into power. This is the second book by him that we've published. We started by publishing his second book first, which is A New Nobility of Blood and Soil, which we've also done an episode on that with Warren Baylog. So highly recommend that people also check that out as well, especially if you like this one and you find it interesting. Yeah, that one deals with pretty much, they're both pretty much as the title presents, a new nobility of blood and soil. So how the concept of blood and soil is related to both National Socialist ideology as well as the development of nobility as a characteristic of the Germanic peoples. And in this one, the peasantry as the lifeblood of the Nordic race. Again, that's exactly, the subject is exactly as the title indicates. He's talking about how the Nordic race has been a fundamentally peasant people, and this isn't there's kind of like a negative connotation today to the word peasant. I think he notes that as well in the preface, that people tend to associate it with like poverty or powerlessness, things like that, kind of like the dirty gray Middle Ages that you see in movies. But that's not what is meant here by peasantry. The peasant that he has in mind is like a small landowner, the head of a farming household. This is fundamentally a position that is a source of a lot of positive characteristics of the Nordic peoples as he understands it. The source of like a work ethic, as well as of free thinking, political independence, and a lot more besides. So anyway, that's actually kind of a long introduction, but I want to toss it back over to you guys to just give your whatever opening thoughts you want, and then I guess we'll go from there. We'll see what we want to talk about first. So maybe Eric, if you want to go first this time, and then Zach.
Sure. So, on the one hand, he's looking into the origins of the Nordic people and why they have the particular characteristics that they do. On the other, in searching for that origin, he's also looking to articulate a very clear program, ultimately, of eugenics and racial hygiene. So, he kind of frames this in terms of an anthropological debate between himself and contemporaries like Fritz Kern, who wasn't really a rigorous anthropologist. He was just a popular academic and writer. He was an opponent of the National Socialists. And he put forward the idea that the long headed races, the dolichocephalic races, have a common origin in some kind of nomadic pastoralist society, likely from the Southeast European steppe. And that spread into Semitic peoples, into Nordic peoples in the manner basically of conquest. So you had this ruling dolichocephalic elite master race. Remember, this is Kern, an opponent of the National Socialists, putting forward this idea of history and prehistory. Whereas Darre, who actually was in the party, he was the Minister of Agriculture ultimately, he argued against this master race conception, saying that the Semites and their nomadic pastoralism were characterized by very different social circumstances. And also, there's evidence in their legal systems, in their myths, of a deep antiquity in desert environments. Whereas if you look at the records of the Romans, the Greeks, ancient records of the Germanic peoples generally, it's clearly from a continental European deciduous forest, highly, a lot of rainfall. And so he kind of points to this difference between the Semitic nomadism and then instances where pastoralism has been practiced in Northern Europe and the steppe. Now, I'd just like to comment, anthropologically speaking, the truth is kind of in between Kern and Darre, right? On the one hand, there was a steppe population that did spread, probably some degree of dolichocephalic indexes, but also spreading with horse domestication. That is the actual Indo-European people. Darre is basically saying that the root of the Indo-Germanic languages, as he would call them, is in Northern Europe and spread from there. And the modern theory would be the Ukrainian steppe, Western Russia as well. On the other hand, Kern is not entirely right in that this spread simply as a nomadic conquering race subjugating local peoples. So you imagine you have all these brachycocephalic, or however you pronounce it, people in Central Europe, and then Kern's master race comes in, the dolichocephalic ones who have common ancestors with the Semites, and they subjugate the local people. And whereas what actually happened was the pastoralists of the steppe did practice agriculture. So they had goats and pigs and cows and all of these other animals, as well as plant domesticates. The agriculture of the Pontic-Caspian steppe actually goes back to like 6000 BC with the bug sniper culture. So, and that was hunter gatherers indigenous to the region who adopted agriculture, probably influenced by the Near East, and then also secondarily from East Asia. They got pots from East Asia and so forth. So that's the actual history of the Indo-Europeans. They were an agricultural people, and there is a difference between the kind of pastoralism they practiced and Semitic nomadic pastoralism or Siberian nomadic pastoralism, where those people do just follow the herds and are basically parasitic upon the herd. Whereas agricultural pastoralism, these are sedentary people. They build fences and protect their animals. So they really benefit their livestock as opposed to parasiting off of them. Um, so that sort of is the core distinction. There are productive, settled people who grow their own wealth, so to speak. And then there are more parasitic, nomadically inclined people who do view social capital as something to be extracted. And he draws analogies with, of course, the financial system, which is predatory and usurious. He will attack like the urban lifestyle as not having a mechanism to select for physical robustness and good health and things like that. And we know that that is true. In urban industrial conditions, selective pressures are mitigated and mutational load rises. And so, although Darre's precise anthropological account, it's hard to defend in terms of the modern state of archaeology and genetics, there's enough truth to it that really I kind of agree with his core thesis that there is a deep seated difference in temperament and a different type of person that gets produced when you have productive societies that are sedentary and agriculture based, and then you have these kind of more mobile parasitic societies. We can get into the specific character traits associated with these two types, but I like the framing. You know, it got me thinking a little bit differently about different aspects of our modern world and how they fit in. You know, urban life versus rural life, the nature of finance, thinking in terms of mechanism and extraction economically versus organicism. He also discusses the nature of philosophical insight and why Nordic people, conditioned by this yeoman farmer existence for millennia, want to connect with the cycles of nature and understand things at a deeper level beneath the surface, whereas those raised in an environment where they had to extract resources from whatever was available, whether that's other settled peoples or their livestock, for them it's just what is tangible, what can be basically taken and used and appropriated. So yeah, big fan of the framing, and I'll hand it over to Zach.
Yeah, thank you. Great assessment. So, I guess my kind of preface of the book, or where I took a lot of interest, was his initial beginning, where he discusses this contrast between the nomadic and the settled peoples. Right? It's almost kind of discussing the international compared to the national. So you have this national group that spawns from this quite literally shared land area, right? When they begin to till the soil and create these foundations, build a tribe, and they live on this land, they gain a connection to the land. This is kind of where things like architecture spawn from, different cultural life, like sculptures and statues and paintings. These things are kind of inspired by the land itself, right? And the fact that the people is connected to a land. You even see this in modern America. A lot of American art. Think of Norman Rockwell, for example. His art had a specifically American tinge to it. All of the things that were displayed, the attire that people were wearing, or even the people themselves displayed in his paintings, there's a very clearly American look or an American description to these things. So Darre kind of explains this difference between the nomadic and the settled peoples, and this is kind of where National Socialism took contention with Jews, right? It's where Jews became considered a parasitic people group because they are not only are they international, they would be kind of considered intra-national in the sense that they constitute a nation within a nation, but they don't have a history of having agricultural land and farming, tilling the soil, building these architectural structures that are uniquely of their people. You know, a good example is to just think of you think of Rome and you think of the architecture of Rome. Every single person can picture that in their mind, what Roman architecture looks like, or even Chinese architecture or Russian architecture. You can think of those things in your head and instantly picture them. You can't really do this for Jewish architecture because them being a nomadic peoples and moving back and forth, they never gained this connection to a land area in order to have interest in essentially making that land area look nice or look pretty, which again kind of goes back to this idea of they are parasitic on culture in the sense that they're incapable of creating a fresh culture. They have to kind of take off of what already exists and subvert that.
Let me just chime
So
in really quick and say, even according to the Bible, they didn't build Jerusalem. Like there are verses saying other people will till your fields for you and you'll reap the benefits. You'll get these whole cities without having to build them. So yeah.
Yes, exactly. Again, inherently an uncreative people, not in the sense that they're unintelligent or can't physically do things, but rather that they cannot create anew, especially when it comes to the field of culture, architecture, painting, these things. They take what already exists and they create their own variant of it, and they kind of abuse this substance. And one other thing I kind of wanted to mention too, because Taylor, you said this in the beginning, and I think it's also really important to hammer on, is the choice of the word peasantry. Because like a lot of words in the modern age, they have the meaning of them has become distorted and misunderstood. And peasantry, as you were saying, does not have this negative connotation, or it's not supposed to have it. It comes from the Latin word pagus, right, which is essentially rural or a farming people, right, a rural class of people. Now in the modern age, people take on the term peasant, and they think almost everybody when they hear peasant thinks to like the Middle Ages, where you have these people in torn clothes who are begging on the street for money or something, barely able to get by, can't keep themselves clean. That's what people think of. But Darre is kind of trying to reestablish this word itself as a meaningful word and pushing towards the actual agricultural meaning of it. I thought that was a very intelligent choice by him, and he kind of does go into that a little bit in New Nobility of Blood and Soil, which we discussed before. That kind of usage of the word peasant.
Yeah, definitely. No, I like what you guys are saying. So I think Eric, you'd mentioned, or both of you mentioned, kind of how the book starts. He's advancing this initially as an argument against kind of, I don't know, maybe say like the pop history of his day, or at least ideas that are popular enough that he wants to respond to them. And what he's responding to is what's probably a lot of people have in their minds is kind of like the simplistic, dumbed down idea of what the National Socialists would have thought, which is that, you know, this Germans are this purely blonde-haired, blue-eyed master race that are exploiting everyone. And his argument is precisely the opposite, that his own race that he's advocating for is not an exploitive race. It is not just like a tribe of wandering, mindless conquerors, but that that isn't compatible with being a race of civilization builders. And I think there's definitely modern kind of parallels to this in the political discourse. I think there's the same kind of tendency to on one side put forward this idea that like this really like kind of at first glance, flattering um, idea of white people being, just this conquering nomadic race, the steppe chariot people and all that. It's kind of like initially flattering, but it's uh, not helpful toward actually understanding ourselves in history. It's not helpful toward actually radical revolutionary politics. To whatever extent you may agree that that's something that we need in our current situation. Um, and it's not, as we can see, it's not actually historically what was the opinion that was held by people like Darre. And I think the opinion that he's putting forward, the both the interpretation of history and kind of the political values that he wants to derive from that, is a lot more moral. It's a lot more grounded. It's ultimately a lot more pragmatic and useful as well. So, you guys have any other thoughts about that?
Well, yeah, the particular personality characteristics he associates with nomadism I found very striking and also plausible. So if you have evolved in an environment where you're not cultivating your local area, but you are dependent upon your local area, your whole relationship to warfare, marriage, the tribe is going to be radically different from that society of yeoman farmers that he envisions as sort of like the primordial Germanic condition. So with the Semites, because they do have to follow their herd, they're not tied down to defending and protecting any one place. They don't think organically, they think opportunistically. And so when severe violence has a payoff, they're willing to employ violence to an extreme degree. But they're not exactly naturally courageous because if they're in an inferior position, militarily speaking, they will meekly submit and play along. And it's interesting that this is essentially what is advocated in the Quran by Muhammad, that when you're in the minority, play nice and say it's a religion of peace. And then when you're in the majority, dominate the others. So it does kind of, bear out when you actually look at the practices of these nomadic pastoralists versus an agricultural people like the Indo-Europeans have always been from our inception. The same thing applies to the, Tatars or the Siberian steppe nomads, and then the behavior that they exhibit once they get into power in a place like, Soviet Russia. This ruthless extractive violence combined with a kind of cowardly temperament, where they will retreat. They have no qualms about retreating and hiding and being dishonorable. Whereas the yeoman farmer who has his lineage is tied to the history of that land. He must stay and defend his land. So, like, our notion of what courage involves is kind of conditioned by our ecological niche that we've occupied. And then in terms of marriage, where this extreme extractive violence on the part of men is the predominant feature of the economy, men are disproportionately powerful. Women become a commodity, just like everything else in their environment, something to be exploited, appropriated. And so these peoples often practice polygamy. There are, examples from Soviet Russia of some of um, these dictators who actually did maintain harems and so forth. Um, so so that lines up as well. And then the kind of careful genetic matching that's intrinsic to marriage in the context of a small community of yeoman farmers that are somewhat democratic. Like, every marital decision is so consequential. You're naturally looking for these characteristics. You can't like polygamy wouldn't be tolerated. It wouldn't be beneficial for the community if that was practiced. And so just the caliber of decision making regarding eugenics and genetic stock goes up, as opposed to the nomadic impulse, which is simply to again extract what you can where you can, both reproductively in terms of your environment. He also talks about how they rendered previously arable lands into deserts. Um, and I think there's actually a lot of truth to that. And probably, even North Africa going far back enough. Of course, we know it wasn't always desert. I often wonder, how much does that have to do with ecological practices of the people living there? But yeah, that's what I wanted to add.
Yeah, I'll tack in here too. One of the kind of interesting things is, first off, just how insightful when you read this book and you see that the problem that he's kind of articulating about modern industrialization, and the more that this develops, the more people move from these rural areas and kind of join this industrial revolution, if you will. They start to this is where you start to see race mixing. You see kind of standards start to lower themselves, and this goes a bit in connection with what you were saying earlier here, is that when you're not tied to a specific land or the achievements of that specific land, then you're kind of also not tied to the people group. So inherently, in order to be a racialist, you have to be tied to something, right? Someone who is a racialist is tied to their people group. But these people that are tied to no land, of course, are not going to be racialists. And that, it's a very simple insight, but it's not something that is thought about or discussed often. But you can even see this just in a modern American context. If you go to more rural areas, even more rural states in general, they tend to lean a lot more conservative, a lot more right leaning. The more industrialized and the more modern a place is, whether it's a state or a city or whatever the case is, the more you start to see these kind of left wing ideologies, which are all against a traditional heritage or a traditional foundation. That's where these things start to spawn. That's where race mixing is the example he kind of uses, and it's pretty much like what he attributes to the origin of it. That is obviously something that is purely in these like high city areas. You don't really go out in rural states in the United States and find a lot of race mixed couples or people that have kind of gone beyond those bounds on like some ranch or farm in the middle of nowhere. But you do see this almost everywhere you go in city life.
Unfortunately, sometimes you do see older white couples, like grandparents, raising the mixed kid that was a bastard child in the city. But, you know, it is what it is.
That is a damn shame. I have seen that in cases, and I think that still is in a sense, it is very much that they are traditional, not in the sense that they are traditional in the idea of race mixing, right, or the outlook of that, but they love their children and their family, and unfortunately, they confuse this connection with, or maybe not confuse. They do not connect the race as their extended family in the same way that they would connect their family as somebody that they hold dear and they want to look after. You do see that a lot, though, in the modern age with older people that uh, basically just haven't looked at racialism on a scale of an extended family, which I think they would have had they been not in this postmodern industrial civilization that we live in.
Yeah, well, I think it also goes to a lot of what you were saying goes to, I think, one of his main kind of underlying philosophical premises is, which he does spell out at one point, which is that everything essentially is derivative of the genetic stock, of the racial stock. Ideology, he says, is ultimately something that comes from blood. And so I think you could probably, like you're saying, you can look at modern dynamics in America between rural and urban, and you could probably look. I would say, I'd venture to say, you can look more long term at the history of America itself generally, and you can kind of see this play out. Similarly, as he, in some parts of the book, discusses the English, and he kind of comes to their defense a little bit from the perspective of how they are um, displaying a lot of some of their behaviors ultimately rooted in the same kind of noble peasant characteristics that he's talking about, and um, and so in America, you had the white uh, populations, which I think someone can correct me if I'm wrong about it, but I believe that his idea of Nordic is again, it's pretty broad. It would essentially encompass most white people, and so you had the white race emigrate to North America, and initially was much more connected to the land. Um, of course, there was always a greater kind of element of expansionism or imperialism that was present here as we moved across the continent. But there was a much more robust tradition of kind of like the yeoman farmer than you have now, and it's taken a long time to reduce Americans to what they are at this point, which is very rootless. And you're probably everyone's familiar with how much like people move around, and this is something that's just considered normal. And uh, it was something that I was thinking of while reading as well. It's like just like you were saying, Zach. It's hard to be a racialist or a nationalist if you don't have a connection to a specific place, and it has to be a very deep connection. It has to be, I think, kind of like Eric said earlier. You're rooted there, you're grounded there. That's your place. You're not moving around. You're not like the nomad that can like sacrifice his place for convenience or safety or something like that. If you're capable of making the trade-off between safety and your place, then probably at some level you can't really be a nationalist in the long run, or you're not cut out for like an existential um, struggle with an enemy that's willing to. You're kind of like you're telling them where the bar is. If you threaten my safety, then I'll leave. I'll give you whatever you want. And so that's ultimately incompatible with being a nationalist. You have to be rooted and grounded in a place. And I think it is unnatural, the rootlessness of American society. It is something that's unnatural to white people, but that has been gradually over a very long time. It has been conditioned into white Americans, and I don't know a way around it other than people are going to have to stop being this way, and it's probably going to be a ideological development that gets people to stop and say, no, I'm going to stop living like this. I'm going to put down roots. I'm going to be part of an I mean, it's like you said, Eric. I think Dario would probably love RTTL for this reason. But it's certainly one model of this. But yeah, so I don't think you can be a nationalist without being willing to say that you're going to ultimately fight and die for your piece of soil.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another key distinction behind the motive for conquest is pure extraction versus settler colonialism, where it's a surplus population issue. And that's how Germany in general was framing its own colonial ambitions. They had this huge population and they didn't have colonial territories to send them to, which was a lot of the motive behind the National Socialist platform and living space and all of that. But it does also bear out once again when you look at, let's take the original Indo-Europeans as they go into established civilizations and actually do take on that kind of master race role, like Kern suggests in general for the spread of dolichocephalic peoples. They do degrade racially. They lose those characteristics which they originally acquired in the Pontic-Caspian steppe as an agrarian people. As they go west, so just to clarify again, Darre believes that the Indo-Germanics originated in Northern Europe, pretty much. And then some of those traits spread from there. The actual case is they originated or the speakers of the Proto-Indo-European language originated probably in the Russian steppe, Ukrainian steppe, and then migrated west to Northern Europe with the corded ware culture. And I think that's the actual empirical evidence that Darre probably is picking up on in archaeology, that corded ware culture itself does expand very broadly. So the movement is, say, around 3,300 BC. The Yamnaya culture begins expanding. Darre doesn't know about this culture, but we know now they weren't exactly Nordic. They had some similarities to Nordic peoples, but the ethnogenesis of the modern Nordic person happens a little bit later and a little bit further west, more towards Central Europe, with the corded ware culture, the battle axe culture as it moves further north. And then that group, the corded ware culture, is responsible for the majority of further Indo-European expansions. So essentially, this second wave of Indo-European expansions can be modeled pretty well along the lines that Darre suggests in general. But when you look at that expansion first to the west, it is settler colonialism. They have a population surplus. And unlike what Darre suggests, just to get the actual anthropology clarified from what Darre believed, I like Darre's framing. Just we should know like the where he got it wrong. So the Indo-Europeans early on were practicing polygamy, and so part of this population pressure was younger sons who weren't going to inherit lands. They were forced to go out, form manor bunds, and conquer new lands, more like what Kern suggests. However, they weren't just going and dominating settled peoples in most cases. Occasionally, they did that in the Near East, in India, but as they moved into Central Europe, primarily it was a population replacement, and it was males and females going on these migrations. And it was genuinely this kind of disseminationist, we have to do something with our excess population kind of colonialism or expansion. And so that's like the good expansion versus the bad extractive expansion.
If I may, would you say that it's fair to word the distinction as migration versus actual nomadism, like a lifestyle of nomadism versus a population that is migrating or has like a migratory period in its history?
Sure. Yeah. And he points at the example of the Germanic incursions into Roman territory. And it says this too is an example of settler colonialism. They were looking for lands to till, they weren't looking for territory to conquer and extract wealth from. And the actual fact, which again, Darre doesn't necessarily know, is that they were pushed. Not even by population pressure, but by a genuine nomadic people, the Huns, who were attacking their territories in the east. And so many of these peoples ended up migrating and then seeking refuge where they could get it. But yeah, it is an example of an authentic migration of an otherwise settled people. He's also very essentialist about it and doesn't believe that a nomadic people can transition easily into a settled people. And he doesn't think that settled people naturally become nomads. It's only a degeneration of this settled stock that approximates to nomadism and the associated characteristics, as he mentions with feudalism and urbanism and all of that. But yeah, so it is really I like the dichotomy, the nomad and settled thing. It matches metaphysically with my own view as well. Like the good is generative, it produces, it's tied to organic cycles, it's inherently philosophical, and evil is parasitical, acquisitive, wants to appropriate. And when we look at the history of America, initially we had this Nordic, more agrarian, peasant or yeoman farmer stock, and it built the foundation of the most powerful country in the world. We've built up all of this wealth. Australia, same kind of stock, built up this massive wealth. South Africa, the Boer, built up massive wealth. And then later, these societies decline as more urbanite and intrinsically nomadic people start migrating. And I wouldn't say that he would treat all European people equally as Nordic. I think he thought that Nordic people were basically from northern Central Europe, and that was the original Indo-Germanic people, and all those kind of good characteristics spread from there and have their roots. And we, should get into this in a little while, deep in the Ice Age. And his Prehistory is also pretty fascinating. The Celts are like a step down from that, and then Nordic races or Mediterranean races are a step down from that. And if you look at the history of America, the Nordic peasant stock built up all the wealth of the nation. And then as these cities became available, the other European races in their conception came in and shifted the culture away from that kind of peasant life that is eugenic, that is generative and connected to organic cycles.
Yeah, I like your point on migration, right? In that most settled peoples historically, they're not migrating out of sheer boredom, right? This isn't like they just kind of want to go conquer some land, kill a bunch of people off, and then move on to the next land, and vice versa. It's rather circumstance kind of forces them into those migrations, whether it's political strife in the current civilization that they live in, or it's something as simple as there's not enough land for them to sustain the population, or there's not enough resources in the general area. So they migrate, they look for places where maybe the climate is better, or maybe they're more capable of sustaining their population in a larger massive area. But that migration is not just for personal benefit or like individual gain, right? Meanwhile, if you look at specifically the Jewish migration into the United States of America is a really good example of this, where they did not migrate into America because necessity kind of pushed them there. They migrated there because they saw something that they could take advantage of in a much easier fashion, right? If it was the case that necessity pushed them there, they would have gone to South America, right? Or they would have gone maybe somewhere in Russia, right? They went specifically to a state that already existed that they knew they could continue to be a parasite on that newly founded state, or well, newly founded land for them to join. And I think this is a really important exemplification of why America has become such, or why a lot of the National Socialists had this disdain for America, right? Because we have those capitalist roots, we have this very modern industrial civilization that has kind of taken on this role of this love for the material, right? There is no kind of rooted love in the ethos of modern America. It's very much lost its way. Most people, if you would ask them, what does it mean to you to be an American? The response you would probably get from most people would be either a something very materialistic, like chasing money or becoming popular, like a celebrity or something, or you would get the answer of the American dream, which again is always very consumer driven. It's a very individualistic ideal. This idea that I can come here and it's all about me. I can become the best version of myself and do anything I want to do, make any amount of money I want to make from whatever path. But none of that has a stronger tie to, again, tradition or something that's more grounded than just these material desires that people have today.
Yeah, no, I agree. I was kind of thinking of while reading the book, like this, what he derives from this difference between like peasant or settled versus nomadic peoples, this kind of like creative, generative people versus a parasitical, exploiting people. I do think it's a useful, certainly a very interesting analytical framework when you look at, for example, like you're saying, Zach, the United States today, and like what it is a country that demographically is composed of, still in large part, a European descended population, but in terms of its culture, in terms of its economic organization, in terms of its foreign policy, its political practices, it has taken on this exploitive mindset, and it's I think it's explainable by just the fact of Jewish power having such a prominent role in America. And I think when you kind of think of it that way, when you put that analytical framework over it, then it really kind of puts into contrast how this is a fundamentally foreign idea and a foreign way of life that is being foisted onto white people, which is inimical to our ability to survive, really, because this is not how we were formed, and we can't adapt ourselves to this without losing a great deal of what it means to be ourselves. And in the long run, it's probably just going to result in a more fundamental loss or defeat if it's not reversed. Um, but if either of you have any more thoughts kind of along these lines, you can go ahead. If not, Erica is interested in asking you. You mentioned Darre's Prehistory. If you want to get into that.
Yeah, I love prehistory. So Darre's perspective, I think, does have enough truth to justify a lot of his analytical framework, but it's helpful to know exactly where he went wrong. So he basically thought that the Ice Age population transitioned smoothly in Northern Europe down to the Bronze Age population, the farming population, and that the acquisition of agriculture was a very gradual process. Obviously, he did not know that the farming societies of Europe were introduced via Anatolia. That's widely accepted today in anthropology. So he kind of leaves that out. A lot of what Darre says about this settled generative peasant stock would apply to Anatolian farmers as well. And actually, that particular population that Darre, I think, is anthropologically pointing to or archaeologically pointing to as the original Indo-Germanic speakers, that is this corded ware culture that had already mixed to a substantial degree with Neolithic farmers in these really big settlements that existed in Western Ukraine of the Kukateni Tripoli culture. Some of those settlements had up to 40,000 people. So maybe there was a bit of urbanism in those societies as well. But most of the Neolithic farmers of Central Europe would have been more or less what Darre describes as this like primordial peasant condition of agricultural Northern European. So small settlements, Dunbar sized units, self governing, individual plots for their agriculture, and then communally managed forest lands. So, yeah, his mistake is basically thinking that agriculture was an autochthonous development rather than an import. It was imported. However, I think what he's getting at, there is some truth to, because we do know that Cro-Magnon in Europe, going back, tens of thousands of years, had a significant impact on the local flora. So there was some kind of forest management system, and we don't know the full extent of it. Now, when you look at the Anatolian farmers, they're also descended from the same genetic stock as the Cro-Magnons of Europe. So, although they're not strictly European, the Cro-Magnon ethnogenesis, I think, did itself take place in Europe with the Arygnacian culture and then spread from there and ultimately seeded the Caucasus hunter-gatherers and Anatolian hunter-gatherers. So I think that's like this element of truth in Darre's conception of the antiquity of the Nordic race. He's talking about the Cro-Magnon race, which is really broad and is the origin probably, or the seed of this differential attitude of Caucasian peoples in the broadest sense, and then also East Asians inherit genes from that same Upper Paleolithic, West Eurasian sphere. So I think there is a definite type, and they would recognize, the Japanese and other cultures can also have this kind of peasant nature. And maybe it is actually rooted in some very deep kind of forest management system that evolved, like Darre suggests, very gradually in Central Europe. And in fact, the earliest sedentism found in the world is at Dolní Věstonice in Czechia. And that's going back, nearly 30,000 years ago. And they had a settlement with around 150 people, and it lasted thousands of years. A lot of rich artifacts are found there. So I think Darre is kind of on the right track where something did emerge or evolve in Europe in the Ice Age that led to the agricultural mentality. What he's missing is the Neolithic Revolution as it actually occurred in the Near East. And there, typically, as we've seen, there's kind of some truth in Kern's perspective and some truth in Darre's perspective. And the actual facts on the ground behind the Neolithic Revolution was there was a very extractive elite dynamic that did rule over what looks to be essentially a slave class. You can tell that from the Gini coefficient of burials, or inferred from burials. You can tell that from the disproportionate genetic legacy of a small subset of men in Neolithic societies. So that's with the origin of agriculture. What actually happened was Cro-Magnon type peoples were present in Anatolia. They built Göbekli Tepe, this ritual center, and then different racial stocks got involved in some complex arrangement where some form of exploitation was involved. That led to agriculture as we know it, and that migrated into Europe. But when it got to Europe, it became much more egalitarian because they didn't have the same population pressures and like established urban centers. So by the time agriculture reaches Europe from Anatolia, there is that Cro-Magnon background, like Darre is kind of pointing to, in a very deep time depth. And then it has other characteristics that Darre associates with this ancient Nordic type. So basically, my takeaway, combining Darre's thesis with modern anthropology, is that he should have been a little bit more lenient with the Nordic race and not assumed that the Mediterraneans would not also have this kind of peasant nature.
Well, thank you. That was a very comprehensive history lesson. Yeah, I think that's fair. Obviously, you're a lot more informed about these things than I am. I'm not really positioned to argue, but it makes sense to me as you've laid it out. So I guess just out of curiosity, do you personally believe in single origin for the human race, and that origin was probably in the Middle East or Africa? I'm just curious about your personal opinion.
Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by like human species per se. I think behaviorally, modern humans, I follow the genetic evidence and say that when we admixed with Neanderthals, that created a new type of person that was pretty similar to the Cro-Magnon. The Cro-Magnon is like the more refined version of that initial Upper Paleolithic stock that did emerge maybe in the Near East, although it definitely could have emerged in Europe, because the cultures that people will point to for the emergence of that Neanderthal admixed stock would be like the Emiran culture in the Levant. But that culture is actually preceded by a cave find in France with a lot of the same tools. Like it looks like the characteristic Emera point is found in this random cave. I think it's the Minot cave in France. However, we really just don't know precisely where this admixture happened. And the Minot cave find is a little bit anachronistic with the available genetic evidence as far as when the admixture took place, which should have taken place over a period of roughly 2,000 years, from approximately 50,000 BC down to approximately 48,000 BC. Again, the cave in France is 55,000 BC. I'm just as inclined to believe that our genetic estimates or modeling have some flaws, and actually the ethnogenesis of behaviorally modern humans happened in Europe. But again, that's maybe it was the Levant, maybe it was the Near East. I don't think it was Africa. And I do think that behaviorally modern element entered Africa, accounting for a lot of developments there that then get wrongfully imputed onto sub-Saharan Africans as if they were the originators of the Upper Paleolithic. But when you are really strict with the timeline there, they're always like 10,000 years behind Upper Paleolithic developments elsewhere. So that's the long answer to a short question. I do think behaviorally modern humans, as we know them, had a single origin. It could have been in Europe or the Levant.
Gotcha. Interesting. This is a serious question. Do you think that we came from Hyperborea in the Arctic Circle?
I don't think so. I have my own theory about Hyperborea. I have a video on my YouTube channel about that. But do you?
Have you ever heard of the book The Arctic Home in the Vedas?
I have. I didn't read it.
I've read most of it. I don't know. I tried to do a little more research to see if it's ever been like its ideas were engaged with by anyone that I could get like a counter argument, because it's fundamentally the argument is based on translations of the Vedas and what like specific words actually mean. But essentially, the argument is that if you look at these very old religious rituals of the Vedic peoples, that there are things recorded in them that only make sense if you with the hypothesis this came from a people who were originally located in the Arctic Circle, because they described certain astronomical phenomena that are unique to that location. So I think it's at least an interesting theory. I'm willing to consider it. But what's your the short version of your personal theory on Hyperborea?
Well, I think Hyperborea, strictly speaking, was one element of a broader pan, like northern Eurasian culture that went from the Celts through the Scythians through the Tocharians. And that actually the people that the Greeks were talking about, like strictly speaking, the Hyperboreans, originally did refer to the people of the Tarim Basin, uh, which I think at that time wouldn't have been Tocharians themselves. But it's interesting, the
And
Vedas,
where is that?
Hinduism, they
Sorry.
talk
Uh,
Western China. So it's like
Oh,
this
okay.
ring. If you look at a map, it's a big ring of mountains. The Himalayas are to the south, and these smaller mountains are, surrounding the rest of it. And it was an agricultural people, Indo-European language speaking. They have these famous mummies, that Tarim Basin mummies. They're like blondes and redheads, and people are like, why are there Caucasians in China? And so anyway, I think that they were the same people who are referenced in Hindu writings as the Uttarakuru, who were highly regarded and seen to be basically like a race of philosopher sages. And they also wore like costumes relatively similar to the Celts. The same kind of Tartar patterns are seen in both cultures. And from that, and then some other details about the Greek and later beliefs about Hyperboreans, I think there was essentially this like shamanic wisdom tradition that did influence Greece through Orphism, but actually has its deeper origins in the continuing legacy of the Indo-European peoples of the steppe, going all the way west to form the basis of Celtic wisdom, and all the way east to form the basis of that Tocharian or Tarim Basin wisdom. Again, who would be the authentic Hyperboreans in the strict sense.
Gotcha. That's very interesting. This is the kind of stuff that I love hearing about, and I always wish that I had more time to kind of research it on my own. But to date, that has not happened. Yeah, I'll just throw this out there if people are interested in the Arctic home and the Vedas. Some of the arguments the author puts forward are, for example, there's this reference to a procession of 30 dawns, and his argument is that this is just like an arbitrary like designation for a month or 30 days. It's not possible to derive any special meaning from it unless you take it to mean that it is actually a dawn that lasts for the length of 30 days. Another example is like a reference to a long day and a long night, meaning like, a time of night or of light and dark that takes, the equivalent actual length of time of multiple days or even months. I think he also says that the eight-legged horse of Odin is a reference to 8 months of sunshine. So it's that kind of stuff, that kind of argumentation. So like I said, I find it interesting. I don't know. There's probably people who would be better able to tell me whether or not it's plausible. But that's the kind of line of thought.
Before we move on from this, because it is kind of a digression from Darre, I think the Andronovo culture from like 2200 BC is generally attributed or thought to be the origin of the Vedic writings. In Sintashta in southern Russia, you have horse burials that exactly match the descriptions of burials in the Rig Veda, and that's before the invasion of India. So definitely, like, the Vedas don't come from India; they do come from the steppe, and those people on the steppe very likely would have traveled into the Arctic Circle. Um, they were a highly mobile people, not in the sense of nomadism, but just in the sense that they were riding horses and they had these really long distance migrations all at once. So I think they were curious people. And so that might account for why they know about astrological or astronomical phenomena from the Arctic Circle. But yeah, I don't know. The other thing about Darre is, like, with his northern origin for the Nordic race, he kind of gets the timing wrong for reindeer domestication. And I think he's not being uh, just like plausible in terms of the ecology and its ability to support a kind of proto agrarian society. But again, I already outlined where I think Darre went wrong. That where he went right is deep in our lineage is this tendency towards sedentism, tendency towards rootedness, and then that is exacerbated, especially since the origin of the corded ware culture, which is less urbanite than the Neolithic farmers, more yeoman farms, more self-governing, very likely, and that's where I would basically get on board with his overall thesis. And again, not every aspect of it, but enough of it is good that it's insightful.
A lot of the evidence he presents in relation to this idea of the ancient cultures, like the Romans, for example, being part of this Nordic, descended from this Nordic peasant people, very interesting. And it also goes to kind of like a broader point, which gets into how this peasant culture was expressed in terms of political values. So he talks about, for example, like the Roman patrician class was until they kind of became culturally degenerated, they often still worked their estates along with their servants and their whoever they had working. The presence of things like wood in their religious ceremonies indicated, again, an origin in a place where there was a lot of rainfall, there was a lot of forests. Obviously wood is very abundant, so it doesn't make sense to have come from like a Semitic like nomadic people. And one of the ones that I found interesting was that he talks about how in his day, and you could probably like think of a lot of like paintings of like European royalty and such. You have like the ermine, or like which is like a fancy kind of weasel essentially, and that's associated with royalty, but that was originally like a common domestic peasant animal. And what his argument is, what this demonstrates is, and there's other examples that he gives of this, is that rulership, authority, leadership among this Nordic race, this peasant, sedentary people, was always something that came kind of up from below. He contrasts it with like Eastern despotism, where you have this clear contrast between the rulers and the ruled. You have a clear kind of like upper ruling class, which in many cases may have been like a nomadic people, and then the lower class. And he says there's a lot of like cultural, religious, linguistic evidence, a lot of evidence in terms of like just ancient German law that indicates that, again, the Germans were originally from this people that began as like this peasant people, and their leaders were from among themselves. It's almost like this is definitely going to be a misuse. This is definitely going to be a misappropriation here, but you could almost like call it libertarian in a certain sense, in that there's a heavy emphasis on like self-determination, self-ownership, the pride of the peasant in working his land, owning his own farm. And he gives, authority, or I think at one point the word Darre uses is loyalty rather than obedience. He gives loyalty to his superiors, with a lot of pride, without the kind of slavishness that he contrasts with like Eastern uh, Oriental systems, which he says, like you can look at Byzantium or you can look at Russia, as especially like Bolshevik Russia as two examples of that. Um, so so essentially the idea is that there's this kind of like first among equals uh, element to leadership and rulership. The relationship between the rulers and the ruled in Germanic society was one based on loyalty rather than obedience, and based on the idea that the leader or the ruler had to be serving some need or some purpose. He was a servant of the people in a sense. I think he uses the words like consent to the governed at some point. And so I think there's a lot there. I think that it's certainly I find it kind of like a compelling origin story for a lot of what I think is kind of intrinsic to our political instincts. So, do either of you guys have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. I think some traditionalists who have read Evola too much tend to think of really intense hierarchies and like god kings as being the like truly conservative position, but not for everyone, because we did have a different relationship with marriage than other groups. I think the gender equality that you see in Western societies is kind of an echo of this very ancient regard for both men and women and their organic function. And it's in these more exploitative type societies where women are actually commodified and looked down upon. And I think if you like analyze the modern culture in that way, you have people in the movement advocating for urban lifestyles, advocating for essentially misogynistic attitudes. And Darre offers an alternative that, maybe it is more appropriate for that Nordic type rather than the Mediterranean type, because there is a way of life that does evolve specifically in Northern Europe during the Bronze Age and Iron Age that is where we get democratic representative government. If you want to know, like, anthropologically speaking, there is this common root of the Italic peoples and Iron Age Hellenes in a Northern Central European based culture, the Urnfield culture. So, as I previously mentioned, the corded ware horizon expands out from the Yamnaya horizon, which is where the Indo-European languages actually come from. That is more hierarchical. There is some polygamy. They're darker complexioned on average. They don't live in a forested environment. But as they migrate west, they turn into the corded ware culture after mixing with some of these settled farming peoples. And then from like 3000 BC down to 1200 BC, let's say, when the Urnfield culture is going, that's when you get the possibility of this kind of yeoman farmer existence. Darre thinks it's primordial, but probably the Neolithic farmers, they were settled agricultural, but they didn't automatically develop a system like the Things. They probably were a little bit more like matrilineal than Indo-European societies, and they lived in longhouses. So you didn't have like individual residences or individual plots. It was probably more like China, where they had these big extended families running very large farming estates. So the difference that really does happen in Northern Europe that is unique to that Nordic race and which does seed the Italics and Hellenes with their elites going into the Iron Age, that's an environment where you have, nuclear family households in small villages, individual plots for agriculture, and then a forest management system that is directed by a democratic process. And yes, they would choose their leaders. And I think this is what he's kind of missing, that was how the Indo-European languages spread. It was this model of the Mannerbund, and essentially all the young guys in a community where, say, all the women were taken up or there was an excess population, they would get together, they would choose some guy to follow. And it was like, I'll follow your lead as long as I get my lands out of it. And so, that is kind of the way that Germanic feudalism did, in fact, spread, and the way that the feudal system originated. Darre views feudalism as a kind of degradation away from this idyllic peasant existence. And in some sense, it is. But I guess what he doesn't recognize is that all of these different practices and complex histories have to converge in Central Europe at a particular time to really give rise to that Nordic stock and the selection pressures that I think he correctly identifies. It's just you can't push it too far back. I think something like what he's really thinking about as that uh, peasant culture, you go from the corded ware culture down to the Urnfield culture, and then it does disseminate into Rome, ultimately Greece. Um, However, the extent to which the elites in Greece and Rome were truly Nordic is debatable. Studies have been done with the Italics, and they were a lot closer to the Celts at the time when they were first forming their cultures than they later became. Later, they became obviously more admixed with Southern Italians and Near Eastern peoples in the late Empire. The Greeks, they were heavily Neolithic farmers. They did receive steppe admixed leaders, but for example, we don't even have remains from classical Athens that we can genetically test. And that's kind of what matters. Like, it would be great to have Spartan genetic samples, but we don't. We have Mycenaean samples, and then we have later Roman era Greek samples. But like that key period when actually they might have been a little bit more Nordic in their racial stock, at least the elites, that is just a total gap in the record. And it's unfortunate because we could validate some of this anthropological thought of people like Darre. But whether they were racially exactly Nordic or not, it is the case that they carried forward those particular cultural practices and views on hierarchy and the role of men and women, respectively, and so forth, and the value of obviously being connected to the soil and organic cycles and all of that. They got that from this root stock that was from Central Northern Europe.
Yeah, I want to jump back too on your point of libertarianism and the peasantry class or the lower folk kind of respecting their leaders and having this loyalty towards them as someone that's a protector of them rather than maybe like a fear complex, right? Which is funny when we frame it this way. When you look at National Socialist Germany, for example, the leadership and the state authority coming from Germany at the time, they've done a good job in modern media to kind of frame that as something that was not through respect, and that you always hear the story about how all these Germans were in complete fear of Hitler as an individual. Right, he was this terrifying authoritarian ruler who just treated everybody horribly, and they felt forced into kind of becoming a part of what was National Socialism, right? And I think that you mentioned libertarianism, but I would also say that I think liberalism kind of stems from this a little bit. You look at liberalism and kind of this like individual liberty and what we call freedom in America. I don't think today in America there is this same level of respect for leadership in the sense of I'm loyal to my leaders or I'm loyal to my country in the same way. And I think this is a product of this modernization of things, where you have whether it's Jewish media or anything that kind of comes from modern media, there is this lack of respect for authority, a lack of respect for discipline and the people that lead over top of you. Uh, People no longer see leaders as something that is to be followed or respected or engaged with, but rather as something that is a hamperment or a temperament for them in their daily life. And I think that that's something that clearly shows that modern America is straying from these racialist roots. And they're losing this kind of concept of a settled peoples, if you will.
Yeah, the Semites and nomadic peoples, they have a sense of hierarchical authority, but it's really everything is the tribe. You know, you are totally indebted to the tribe. All the children belong to the tribe. It's not the authority of an individual. So it's sort of a paradox. On the one hand, the settled peoples, they maintain their way of life by a regard for their individuality, which is part of this broader organic identity, but it's ordered, and you can track estates through generations because it's associated with literal land. And you know, also due to the marriage practices, who is marrying whom, which lines have converged. So the individual in some sense means more, you know, in that kind of society versus the nomadic society where parenthood or, you know, fatherhood, paternity is very uncertain in a lot of cases. uh and so because of that, you like, what particular relationship of fealty do you have to any other particular, you don't even know who your father is, very likely. So it's sort of just an indiscriminate, we're all in it together, which, you know, again, if you look at the state of the discourse today, I think some people confuse that kind of tribalism for loyalty to one's heritage. But real loyalty to one's heritage has to be individually mediated. It has to be this like complex organic system where you interface not generically with the tribe, the identity, but you fit into your particular place. You are individuated, ideally in Carl Jung's sense of that term. But yeah, for many people, like communism is this impulse. They're, and many leftists today, they're not loyal to any man or any figure. They're loyal to a very vague notion of the collective, and everything ought to serve the interests of the collective. But again, paradoxically, when you have a society like that, what you actually get is opportunistic, deceitful people who don't own up to the real authoritative roles that they are in fact playing. They exploit that unclaimed authority that is de facto there, for their own personal aggrandizement. And that's just a stark contrast with the supposedly more authoritarian and hierarchical societies and monarchies that ultimately emerge. Again, Darre doesn't like feudalism and the total despotism and stuff. He wants to keep things much more folkish and peasant in nature. However, when you do look and contrast that classical European nobility, there is noblesse oblige. They have a particular role. They own that role as an individual. They're individually accountable. Um, and so yeah, those kind of intersecting uh, contrasts are interesting. More collective in some sense, more indebted to one another as individuals, and yet more distinct as individuals than in those other cultures where individually they behave more selfishly. They're less a part of an organic system, and yet they have the idea of the tribe kind of indiscriminately unifying them.
Yeah, I think maybe another thing to this, or another way you could see it, is this kind of original peasant state that he's sketching. It had, you know, there was more potential in either direction in that, you know, in this society of independent, peasant farmers who would nevertheless come together. They would largely treat one another as equals, but still be willing to elevate rulers who had more of a sense of servanthood. Um, and at this point, today, kind of like Zach was saying, I think just like the capacity for this kind of life, not to mention, obviously, there's things just like industrial society and uh, just our model of economic organization and all that probably plays into it as well. But I think in a kind of philosophical, cultural, maybe spiritual sense, and probably Darre would say ultimately in a genetic sense, I think that there's just some capacity for this that has been lost, and or at least lost for now. And I think that's probably, you probably could say the same thing about like feudalism or monarchy during the medieval period or later periods in European history, where it's not bad. I guess it's certainly a lot better than what we have today, but it was still in some ways kind of a degeneration from this original state. And he at least sees value in looking to that original state and trying to, I guess, recreate it through National Socialism or approximate it. It's a tweet that I once saw a very long time ago that's always stuck with me, which I think there's at least some truth to, which is that Aryans are anarchists in the wild and fascists in captivity. And I think that there is something intrinsic to this, maybe at first glance paradoxical relationship between what we would think of in a modern sense as like libertarianism or anarchism philosophically, and National Socialism, fascism, a more kind of authoritarian system. I think that there's a deeper relationship between these ideas that finds its root in some way in this original peasant character of the Nordic race that he's putting forward. But that's just my opinion. That may be more controversial, so you guys can feel free to disagree.
No, I like that. I think that's a good way of thinking of it. So we get to a point where it's not just a description of history or prehistory or why we are the way we are. It yields concrete policy proposals and does combine some authoritative measures in order to restore the organic basis of Nordic freedom, Aryan freedom. And that only happens when there are selective pressures creating that type and maintaining that type. You don't get the Nordic type for free. It takes work, it takes hard physical labor to select upon. So those who can't hack it and can't maintain a farming estate in this kind of peasant society, they aren't eligible for marriage, right? So you have to demonstrate that you're fit to be wed. And then when you actually choose your partner, it's not just an individual choice. You are, marrying the estates together, patrilineally handed down, however, but still, it's like the stock that you're wedding into is relevant for your family, relevant for the community, and then there's some difference in a person's rank based on how they fit into that whole farming community and how they relate to the thing and the association. It's like they are free, but only because they have these strong pressures keeping their blood pure and not degenerating into urbanism or nomadism or parasitism. They generate wealth, they generate a population surplus. You want to encourage the population growth because that's how you maintain this particular way of life, which maybe is free or liberal in the classical sense as well, because that living connection with nature and your estate and your lands and your animals, that leads you towards philosophical contemplation, which, Darre would say the Greek philosophers, Roman philosophical thought, that is the Nordic elements of those races coming out, especially, take that or leave that. But yeah, it's like in order to be free as an individual, you have to dominate your lower appetites and not be this parasitical, acquisitive type. You do have to look into the really real and the authentic nature of things. And so you're constrained, if you want to be free, constrained to live in a certain way. And then for a society to maintain freedom and to create the right kind of warrior nobility of blood and soil that can defend homelands, organic homelands that are cultivated over generations like that, you have to not be wholly open as just pure individuals, and also not, tribal communism. It is this differentiated, ranked, and yet egalitarian kind of society. It's like a sweet spot. And I do think, comparing modern anthropological insights here, the combination of the steppe herding element, the combination of the Anatolian farmer element, the combination of the hunter gatherer element, a lot of what Darre is seeing as indigenous to Northern Europe, it comes together in a very unique kind of society building that does maximize for a kind of freedom. It certainly maximized for freedom of thought, and all of the cultures descending from this Urnfield culture and the corded ware horizon, they've achieved the scientific uh, insights that led to our current technologies. They cracked the code of nature, so to speak, because of this eugenic pressure building a certain kind of people through a certain kind of society. And then that's, as I said, what Darre is ultimately pointing us to. And I like these appendices. The SS Order number 65, regulating marriage of SS officers. And that's also very Platonic in a way, where it's like the elite practicing eugenics among the elite is the most important thing. Maybe individuals at lower ranking positions in society can be a little bit less discriminating, but like for our actual martial nobility, you really have to compare the racial stocks and preserve it. And then the other part of this is the Reich heredity farm law, or the Reichser Baugesetz, where essentially you give all these incentives for small farms to maintain ownership in the family. And this is a view towards long run eugenics, as well as keeping the kind of folkish character, the peasant character, as the root of the Germanic people, and not allowing urbanism to spiral out of control. So yeah, I mean, it's again, I really appreciate where he goes with it, which is we need to create more return to the land type movements, create societies of this particular character, um, not feudalism, not urbanism, not parasitism, organic societies, and then ultimately that leads to the organic state, which is a combination of these societies, which is, I guess, the National Socialist ideal. So now we have it at the kind of mesocosm level individually. This creates the type that is philosophical and oriented towards deep truths. They're organic thinkers. And the microcosm, mesocosm, they live in organic collectives that are preserved through the generations. And then macrocosm, the state, is one organic whole at the end of it. So I think it's a beautiful concept. Again, I don't agree with every single little detail anthropologically, but I bet that if Darre was alive today, he would probably modify his thesis slightly, but not as much as you might think.
Yeah, on the note of freedom too, you're kind of explaining one of the issues with this modern degeneration of the concept of freedom, or even the concept of liberty, right? You look at libertarianism. One of the biggest problems with it is the meaning of freedom is heavily distorted from what it once was, right? At one point, freedom, there was discipline, there was some kind of higher standard inside of freedom. Today, freedom, as most people see it, is just complete freedom to do whatever you want, right? So, I have the freedom to go purchase a gun and kill my neighbor or something, but obviously there are repercussions from that, right? People want the freedom without the repercussions, and I think this is the biggest problem with modern liberalism or even libertarianism. It's just utopian, right? Libertarianism They want to not have any kind of restrictions from the government. They want to not be impeded on with anything. But then you get to this point where eventually you need some kind of authority to step in and fix things that are going wrong. If everybody's just their individual living in tents like hippies doing their own thing, uh, when somebody starts kind of disrupting the peace, if you don't have an authoritative structure over top, you can't fix that problem. So freedom has to have even restrictions in itself. Freedom can't just be this completely ambiguous thing that is different for everybody and they can all do it in their own way. You have to have responsibility with that freedom. And I think, even in America's inception, although there was a lot of liberalism, and this is where kind of you get this more individual spirit, even when you look at the founding fathers and the things that they were looking at, or their description of freedom or liberty, they still understood that this is only something, in their own words, that works for like a moral people, right? A moral, God fearing people. And what they meant by that is they have to have their own restrictions and confinements too, right? You can't, if everybody just has the freedom to become an alcoholic and everyone's drinking all day, every day, or everyone has the freedom to be a drug addict and is using drugs on the streets, again, that's not capable of creating or upholding a civilization, and therefore that's where you need authority to step in. It has to dictate, hey, no, you can't just kind of get drunk in public, and you can't go use drugs and like hang out and give it to other people, and these things, these are all lacking. We lack the understanding of where freedom has to draw its line. That's the biggest problem, and I do think that that also comes from this same urban degeneration.
Yeah, definitely, and I fits well with what Eric was saying about how ultimately Dari did have a solution to these things. It was to put into place these eugenic laws and practices that would uh, build back up that genetic stock, where you ultimately get the capability for the true kind of disciplined, noble self-governance and authority that we want to achieve. So we're at about an hour and a half here. So I don't want to keep you guys longer if you don't have much time left. But is there anything else that either of you wanted to cover from the book that we haven't gotten to yet?
I covered the main themes that I wanted to address. It is interesting. He, like, even with the kind of fuzzy picture of the past compared to our perspective, he did highlight that salient feature of the Nordic race that he valued. And he recognized that without the conditions that brought us into being, we will not be maintained as the same form that we all, you know, have love for and want to preserve. So I think there's very deep truth in that. I also like the fact that, if he uh, was able to implement those policies here and now, I would be doing what I'm supposed to be doing. So it's always nice to have a little bit of your biases confirmed. And so, yeah, return to the land, incentivize the yeoman farmer, incentivize the thing as the mode of government, these small rural societies. Uh, the urbanites are not the only relevant thing. That kind of power acquisition, it is parasitical. These systems exist, and now parasitical people want to go and exploit them and make them theirs. But that's all. It's more immediate in some sense, like taking power over the government and changing its policies. That's immediate, but it's more important in the long run that we live in a way that will build the right kind of people. We're cultivating who we are as a race, who we are as a people. And so Darre is the kind of person who definitely has the longing to govern rather than a longing after power or something like that. And it's a key distinction. And I think, unfortunately, the potential governors are outnumbered by the power seekers by quite a bit today. So, yeah, Darre's perspective is definitely refreshing.
No, I was going to say I don't have anything to add on my end. I covered what I liked about the book, and I thought it was a great read, especially after reading and covering New Nobility of Blood and Soil. This book kind of is more of the foundation of the worldview, I feel like new nobility of blood and soil is more of this is how exactly that's carried through, or how we go about doing this.
Yeah, definitely. I think they're very good complement for each other, and I've definitely appreciated reading both. I would highly recommend anyone who's interested in one or the other that you read both. Okay, I wanted to. We're not going to have time to get into this as a whole other subject, but I just wanted to read this passage from the book. And I don't think we went into as much detail on this as some of the other stuff we've talked about, but Darre also talks about how, like, the capacity for philosophy is also rooted in this peasant lifestyle, and how it develops like a deeper, more three-dimensional way of thinking, um, and is related generally to a lot of both personality and moral characteristics of the Nordic peoples, like a kind of reserved, calm demeanor, forward thinking, like thinking of tomorrow as opposed to thinking of the present. Um, being therefore necessarily also connected with history. And in this section here on page 235, he says, "Let us return to the relationship between the peasant and his farm. The farming operation exists not only for the peasant, but also vice versa. Um, the peasant manages the whole operation. He is the head, and the others are the limbs. However, as a collective, they all clearly work for the benefit of the operation. Consequently, they all perceive it in its totality. Um, Being a peasant then means having an overall understanding of the organic interplay of the forces at work. The peasant's self-confident sense of freedom and sense of responsibility toward his work and his farm are at the heart of the free man's sense of duty. Service to his work and way of life becomes the noblest act of the free individual. The phrase, 'I am merely the first servant of my state,' is nothing more than the Nordic peasant's worldview elevated to royal lordship. The Nordic peasantry gave humanity that moral standard that measures the actions of a free individual by a higher standard than merely one's own self-interest. It was here that the Nordic race, while still in its cradle, kindly received from Providence a gift out of which its most remarkable trait may well have blossomed, the profound inner desire of the Nordic man to dedicate his life in service to his life in service to a cause or work, deriving his own internal moral guidelines from the necessities that determine that work." And so, part of what I read into that is his explanation of the kind of moral impulse of the European civilization, of European man, again, also comes from this original lifestyle and what kind of people it cultivated. So um, I think we should probably cut it off here. I will say, Eric, if you want to say anything in particular about Return to the Land, kind of using this as a jumping off point, or just in general, to go ahead and do that, and then after that, we'll just do final thoughts, and I'll ask you guys to plug your stuff.
All right. Yeah, I do think that Darre would approve of Return to the Land and appreciate it. There are also precedents in Germany during the feudal age when a lot of formerly free peasants were having to sell their lands to these huge landowners. One solution that people found was owning land as corporate bodies. So that was intentionally a way of preserving that peasant way of life that arose in Germany in the 1800s while this whole serfdom crisis was occurring, and before that as well. But anyway, I think the way that we're going about it has a lot of echoes with return to the land movements that did get government funding when Darre was Minister of Agriculture. And if, we don't have the state to implement these things, but the nature of our race is to produce order organically. That's really what's unique about us, and so we can form our own corporations. We can operate within existing laws, which are ultimately the laws originated by our race in the first place, even if they've been corrupted, there's still, some basis in the notion of rightful place in an organic whole that is measured and not totalitarian and respects the individual and yet places limits upon him. We have that as our basis. Return to the Land is trying to interface with the good elements of that law and also secure precedent to protect our rights that ultimately stem from this kind of race of a peasant nobility, you might say. And so, yeah, Return to the Land, you can find us at returntotheland.org. It's not exactly a National Socialist program being implemented from the top down. We don't have the funding that they would have. However, it is one of the few operations that is actively trying to reinstitute this way of life that is the foundation of who we are. And if we don't go back to it, I think we are going to lose who we are. So yeah, I totally agree with Darre's assessment. Once again, returntotheland.org.
All right. Well, thank you. So I will say, I will. I don't have a lot of closing thoughts. I think we covered a lot of what's in the book. I think it is very much worth reading. If you made it this far in the podcast and you don't own a copy yet, then you should pick it up. And besides that, I'll say you should check out our guests today and everything that they've got going on. So with that, I'll just give it back to you guys. Thank you both very much for coming on and talking to me here. And if you have any closing thoughts about the book, you can give that and then just tell people where they can follow you and whatever else you want people to follow you or know about you, any other social media or projects or anything like that. So Zach, if you want to go first, and then we'll have Eric go after you.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you again for inviting me onto this discussion. I thought this book was another fantastic read to add to my many things that I have been picking up over the last couple months, and it was definitely worth the time. I would also like to encourage the audience to get themselves a copy of the book, and I would say get both. I would say get this and New Nobility of Blood and Soil, and I would definitely recommend reading this one first. This is more complex, but it again lays out the foundation of his worldview and really kind of gives you the understanding of where he comes from. And then New Nobility of Blood and Soil is more of this advocation or the push for what exactly the process is to kind of go about putting his worldview into place, or at least restoring his worldview into place. Because I think this is a worldview that was universally recognized, hundreds of years ago by our people when they were operating under much more organic circumstances. As for myself and self promotion, I go by Logos Revealed online. You can kind of find my stuff on X. I'm on Rumble. I am on Odyssey, although that's kind of a dying platform at this point. I do some shows. I am partnered with Antelope Hill, so you'll see me doing a lot of discussions about different books that they've released and promoting those. I'm sure we'll probably have a podcast like that soon enough. But that's pretty much all I have to promote. Thank you again for having me on. This was a great discussion. And Eric, it was great chatting with you again. It's been quite a while.
Yeah, likewise. We should definitely schedule a philosophy discussion in the near future. Yeah, I basically gave what I wanted to say about the book. I do recommend it. A lot of the time, people want to go back into distant antiquity to, get inspiration for how we can move forward. But there was this period, this very interesting period in the middle of the 20th century. So not that long ago, where people were identifying this decline. They were identifying root causes, and they were coming up with prescriptions that are hard for us to really intuit and grasp immediately, but it is definitely more realistic than establishing a Catholic monarchy or something like that. So, and I also think that they were much more rooted in true history, even if Darre got some details wrong by modern standards, than even something like Catholic monarchies and the feudal aristocracy. So it is reaching deep into the past, but also it's not so far in the past, and you can connect with an author like Darre because he's also a modern man. You know, he lived in a world not too dissimilar from ours. And so some of these solutions I think will be more directly applicable because of that. But yeah, always fascinating to, enter into another era, another world, another worldview with a book like this, especially with a respectable scientific and philosophical thinker who I definitely believe Darre is. So it makes me want to read more from these authors. Again, I still don't necessarily identify as a National Socialist per se, but I don't think we should leave them in the dustbin of history. I think they were serious, well-intentioned men in many cases trying to address very serious problems, some of which we still face today. So yeah, pick up the book. And then as far as my social media, you can find me on X at Aarvoll_ or on YouTube at Eric Aarvoll. If you search Aarvoll, you'll also find me. And I'll probably be making more content on prehistory in the near future, specifically about the Upper Paleolithic, which I'm definitely inspired by reading Darre to think even more about that origin of our race in deep antiquity and how they lived and what they looked like.
All right, awesome. Well, again, thank you guys very much for coming on, and thank you everyone for listening, and we'll see you on the next one.